America did not wake up to chaos. There were no emergency alerts buzzing across phones, no television anchors interrupting regular programming, no sense that anything unusual had happened overnight. Cities moved as they always had. Coffee machines hummed in offices. Credit cards were swiped at gas stations and grocery stores. Passwords were typed into familiar login screens. Everything looked normal, and that normality was exactly what allowed the hack to succeed. Because the most dangerous cyber attacks do not arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine, hidden inside the systems people trust the most. This story begins not with a single criminal breaking into a network, but with a nation placing faith in invisible systems it barely understood. The hack that America didn't see coming was not built on speed or destruction. It was built on patience, familiarity, and silence. For decades, the United States invested heavily in digital infrastructure. Banking, retail, healthcare, transportation, and government services all became dependent on interconnected systems designed to be fast and reliable. Efficiency was rewarded, convenience was celebrated. Security, when it existed, was often built around one assumption: if nothing appears broken, then nothing is wrong. That assumption shaped how networks were designed and how they were monitored. Alarms were created to detect failures, intrusions, and disruptions, but no alarm was built to detect something that behaved exactly as expected while quietly doing something else at the same time. The attacker understood this long before the defenders did. This hack did not start with stolen passwords or dramatic breaches. It began with observation, with listening, with understanding how data flowed through American systems every second of every day. Payment information moved from stores to processors, from processors to banks, from banks to clearinghouses, all following predictable paths. Internal networks trusted devices that were already inside. Wireless connections were treated as private simply because they existed within company walls. Engineers focused on keeping systems running, not questioning who else might be watching them run. In that environment, the attacker did not need to force entry. The door was already open. What made this operation different was not its technical complexity, but its restraint. There was no rush, no attempt to steal everything at once. Instead, data was copied gradually, quietly, blending into normal traffic. Credit card numbers passed through systems exactly as they always had, except now they were being duplicated and redirected without permission. Every transaction looked legitimate. Every system response appeared normal. From the outside, nothing had changed, and because nothing appeared broken, no one thought to look deeper. As weeks turned into months, the scale of the exposure grew. Millions of transactions moved through compromised channels. Personal information belonging to real people was collected without their knowledge. These were not abstract numbers. They were families buying groceries, travelers booking flights, students paying tuition. Each swipe of a card carried trust, and that trust was being exploited silently. The hack did not discriminate. It did not target individuals. It targeted the infrastructure that served everyone. Inside corporations, dashboards showed green lights. Uptime was strong. Performance metrics looked healthy. IT teams focused on efficiency, not suspicion. Security teams waited for alerts that never came. The attacker had no interest in triggering alarms. Silence was the goal, and silence was rewarded. Because in cybersecurity, attention is often drawn to noise, not absence. The systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do, and that design flaw became the perfect hiding place. Eventually, the first signs of trouble appeared far from the source. banks began to notice an increase in fraudulent transactions. Customers called to dispute charges they did not recognize. Cards were canceled and reissued. For most people, it felt like an inconvenience, not a warning. Fraud happens, they were told. Systems caught it quickly. Life went on. What no one realized was that these were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a much larger problem, one that stretched across companies, states, and industries. Investigators struggled to connect the dots. Each case looked small on its own. A compromised card here, a fraudulent purchase there. There was no single breach announcement to point to, no obvious moment where everything went wrong. That absence of a clear starting point slowed everything down, and time was exactly what the attacker needed. Every day that passed without detection meant more data collected, more exposure, more damage layered invisibly beneath the surface of everyday life. What made the situation even more dangerous was how familiar the activity looked. Network traffic patterns remained consistent. Internal communications behaved normally. Nothing stood out as foreign. The attacker did not behave like an outsider. They behaved like the system itself. That is what allowed the breach to grow unnoticed. It did not challenge the system. It mirrored it. When federal investigators eventually became involved, they faced a problem unlike traditional crime scenes. There were no broken locks, no physical evidence to dust for fingerprints. The evidence existed only in logs, packets, and time-stamped records scattered across countless systems. Piecing together what had happened required rethinking how cybercrime was understood. This was not about catching someone in the act. It was about proving that the act had been happening quietly for a long time. As the investigation expanded, the scale became impossible to ignore. Millions of Americans had been affected. Financial institutions faced massive losses. Retailers scrambled to understand how their trusted systems had betrayed them. The public, once informed, reacted with disbelief. How could something this large remain hidden? How could it happen without anyone noticing? The answer was uncomfortable because it pointed inward. The systems had not failed catastrophically. They had failed politely. They had done exactly what they were asked to do, without questioning whether they should. This realization forced a shift in thinking. Cybersecurity was no longer just about defending against attacks. It was about questioning assumptions, about recognizing that trust itself could be exploited. The hack did not rely on advanced tools that only experts could understand. It relied on human habits, organizational blind spots, and a collective belief that if something dangerous were happening, it would be obvious. It wasn't, and that was the most dangerous part. By the time the full scope of the breach began to surface, the damage had already rippled outward. Confidence in digital systems was shaken. Consumers questioned how their personal and financial information had been handled. Companies struggled to explain how such a massive exposure could occur without detection. Executives faced scrutiny not just for technical failures, but for cultural ones. Security had been treated as a background concern rather than a central responsibility, and now the cost of that mindset was impossible to ignore. The financial impact was staggering. Banks absorbed billions in fraudulent transactions, reimbursements, and card replacements. Retailers faced lawsuits, regulatory penalties, and reputational damage that lingered long after systems were patched. Entire industries were forced to reassess their reliance on legacy infrastructure that had prioritized speed over verification. The ripple effect spread far beyond balance sheets. Confidence in digital systems, once taken for granted, became fragile. In response, a wave of changes swept across American cybersecurity practices. Encryption standards were strengthened, internal networks were segmented more aggressively,
Monitoring tools were redesigned to look not just for anomalies, but for patterns that were too normal to question. Companies invested heavily in security training and auditing. Government agencies expanded their cyber units and pushed for greater information sharing between public and private sectors. These changes were necessary, but they came too late to prevent the damage that had already occurred. Despite the reforms, one uncomfortable fact remained. The attacker had succeeded not because they were unstoppable, but because they were unnoticed. The systems had not failed dramatically, they had failed quietly. And that distinction mattered because it suggested that future threats might follow the same path, adapting to defenses not by challenging them, but by conforming to them. Cybercrime was no longer about breaking rules, it was about understanding them better than the people enforcing them.